this good? Is this a good view right here?
Okay, we're getting those last few people in. Great, we can get started here. All right. Okay, it's looking good. All right, Happy New Year to everybody and welcome back. It's really good to see everybody. I really think we're off to another great semester at MCC. And I do also really hope that all of you got a chance to get a break, spend some time with family and friends, and really just recharge and refresh as we get started. I was fortunate enough to get a few days to do a road trip that included everything from dinner with my 96-year-old mother-in-law in New York City to 3 days in Virginia with my 7-month-old granddaughter. And she endlessly and effortlessly entertained 9 adults for the whole 3 days. Not a problem at all. So now at this point, I'm really looking forward to tomorrow when the parking lots, the classrooms, and the whole college just magically fills up. It just goes from empty to full overnight, and it's always really fascinating to see that. And it just brings a sense of excitement to the start of every semester. I just want to take a quick moment here to thank Chairman Campbell, and we've got Trustee Dr. Howard here. Oops. Got to keep that one out. And really thank them for coming and all they do to support the college here. I'd really like to also thank the folks in admissions and enrollment and advising, financial aid, student accounts, all the people who have been working so hard over this break to really make sure we have our students ready for the first day of class. It's a great team. They really work together, and they're doing great work to put our students on the path to success. I also want to have a little shout out to facilities and to IT for all the maintenance and upgrades that they were able to accomplish over the break. It's great that we can always come back and things are a little bit better than when we left. Really doing some great work there. I also want to thank all of you for all the work that you do every day at the college. This is a special place because of what you do to inspire our students to success. And you do that every day here at this college. We hear this over and over from our students, and we hear it repeatedly from members of the community. There are people in this room who have made a difference in our students' lives. People here who go out of their way every day to help our students. So I was out in the community yesterday, heard a story, somebody said, "Oh, I'm working with somebody at your college, they're just the nicest person ever." And he's sneaking along the back wall right now, but that's okay. And it just really is, that reputation that we have out in the community because of the great work that you do. It is a great place to learn, it's a great place to help our students, and it's possible because of the inspirational work that you do every day. So today, I'm going to spend a few minutes on some college updates, and then we have our keynote speaker and panel talking about accessibility here at the college. We'll then have a few minutes on some of the new professional development activities that we're putting in place. Then really a brief bit about strategic planning. There will be a break in there at 11 o'clock so that we can all take a break at that point and refill our coffee cups. And after strategic planning, we'll have lunch. Lunch will be set up out in the hallway. We'll eat here before everybody heads out to their division meetings where they're going to be doing a strategic planning exercise. So then at 3 o'clock, we will have a welcome back reception out here on Main Street. And all I can ask from everybody is, let's keep the alcohol in this building, okay? Let's not wander too far out. We don't need sub-parties out in the other part of campus at this point. Okay, thank you. All right. So a couple of highlights just from the fall. Our Student Advocacy Day down in Boston was really nice. Both Representative Dave Nagel and Tom Golden took some real time to talk to our students on the steps before this picture. So they did a nice Q&A with the students down in the State House. And it was really great to see our students down there really well prepared to advocate. And as you know, they advocate for us better than we ever will. So they were really making the case for increasing our funding and getting more support for public higher education. Okay, shortly after that, we also had the Joint Higher Ed Committee visit us. And here you see Co-Chair Jeff Roy and Vice Chair Jim Arcero from Westford eating lunch with our students. And again, this was, a time for them to interact with our students, to ask our students questions, and they really did a great job informing the key members of the Joint Higher Education Committee about what we could use at this college. And it was really interesting. They also had a chance to learn organic chemistry from Sally Quast. This was another example of the 100% Success Project that, we've got Senator Ed Kennedy learning organic chemistry there. Okay, so next one is really a picture of our dental clinic after we took everything out. And there's blank sheets of paper where they're laying out the new equipment that's going to go in to figure that out. And it now looks like this, all brand new suites for the dental clinic. It's important to note that our dental clinic is both a teaching space, but it's also one where we serve the low-income residents of our community. So it is really a great service to the community as well as a wonderful teaching space. And it's great that we were able to bring together the resources to really put in a first-class clinic. So they've done 12 seats operatories on one side, and they're doing 12 on the other now, and that will be all up and running fairly soon with all the latest equipment and all the latest technology that they need. And what's really great okay. There we go. Okay. Pull it down. Pull that one down. Okay. We got it. Okay. All right. A little technology here. Okay. So the dental clinic, again, is just, a wonderful place to get this going. So we have the resources, we put it together. Okay, we had a wonderful winter celebration, an alumni event at the end of the semester up at Nesmith House. It was right after the FSA meeting on December 13th, and it was really great that we could merge these two events where we celebrated all the hard work that people had done throughout the semester with a nice reception, but also there was an alumni meeting afterwards, and a lot of the faculty got to meet some of their students. It's interesting to see that a few of the people in here who were students are now faculty members and also work at the college. That's really cool. So a lot of fun there. Yesterday was a busy day. Started out with my wife and I going to the Bedford Embraces Diversity event here in town, and that was a wonderful event with a great speaker there. And really nice to see the Bedford community doing an event like this for the third year now. And in Lowell, we had the MLK celebration for the 21st year. This has been going on now since 1999. As you know, this was started by Laura Smith, and it has now been taken over by a whole group from across the community. We met all year, and we put together this event that really brings the community together to celebrate the legacy of a great American hero, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And so we had at this event quite a range of people from the community. We had Mayor John Leahy, Senator Ed Kennedy, Congresswoman Trahan, City Councilor Veshna Noon, Lowell School Superintendent Joel Boyd, Police Chief Kelly Richardson, and we had leaders from across the nonprofit community in Lowell there. So again, a really nice event. It wouldn't have happened without all the hard work of Donna Corbin, who really chaired this committee, and Reggie was one of our two great MCs at this event. Chairman Campbell and Trustee Booker Malone were also there as well. We gave out some awards to community members this year, and Congresswoman Trahan was there for that. She's also going to be on the Lowell campus today for a workforce meeting at 1:30. So the celebration yesterday ended up with everybody linking arms around the room, and it really was a wonderful example of the community coming together. And it's really nice to see people from across the Lowell community coming together to really celebrate the dream that Dr. Martin Luther King had of peace and harmony between everybody. Okay, so let's move on to spring updates. So we are going to engage the college is engaging in a 360-degree review of the president's role here at the college, and we encourage participation in the events. We put out a list of many different events, and it really is a great opportunity to come in and talk with the consultants who are coming in. It's all confidential. That's not the point of what's going on. What we really want to do is, the way I look at this is, like, when I taught, I got evaluations every semester from my students. And many of you who are faculty have been through this routine. You get your evaluations and you look at them. To me, it was never even a remote thought about who put this down. But if there was something negative in there, it was like, okay, how did I miss this? How did I make this mistake? How can I learn from this so I can better serve my students in the class? So I'm looking for your participation in this 360 review to help me better serve you and this college. This is really important for everybody at the college to engage in this. There is the availability to do some individual appointments. You can do them either through Donna Corbin, and again, I'm not going to see any of this, that's not the point of it. Or if you just approach the consultants, they will try to fit you into the schedule. There is some more time on Friday of that week, I understand, but they are going to be here the whole week, and they said they're going to be here from early in the morning till late in the afternoon. They'll meet with people on campus or off campus. And again, that's their process. It's how they go about it. They're skilled professionals, and they will do the best they can to put together a comprehensive report for the Board of Trustees. So I wanted to give you a little enrollment update on this. So in the fall, we were down about 4%, which is what we had budgeted for the fall. It looks like in the spring we're going to be down about a little bit more, probably about 5% or so. We're looking very closely at this, and again, the team has been working very, very hard to close that gap and to meet our goal that we had really budgeted for at 4%. So, there's been a lot of analysis of what's going on and what they can do to do that. A 4% decline over the year means about $1 million loss in revenue. So we are going to be looking at ways we can reduce our costs across the college without affecting those direct services to students. That's really what our goal has been, to make sure that we really put our money in the front lines where it's really helping students to succeed. So we've just gotten these reports. We'll be bringing them to the Board of Trustees in another week, and we'll be talking with them about how do we develop ways to reduce our costs across the college. This is still a fairly normal trend across the Northeast and much of the country. We're not outside the norm here at all, but it is something we're just going to have to keep dealing with in a proactive way as we go along. On the more positive side, the supplemental spending bills, they came in late in the year, and there's another one that Governor Baker put in just recently. Both are supplemental spending bills to the FY20 budget. Okay, so that's how it was. But as we know, the key thing in there was that there was finally funding for the raises from the MCCC contract. And that was way too late in coming. The legislature took a long time to get that through, but it is in effect, so those raises are in and the retro payments will be coming shortly. So we're really happy that that will be coming, long overdue though, to our hardworking faculty and staff in MCCC. Also though, in the supplemental spending bill, through some work that we did with the leaders in the legislature, we were able to get some additional funding for community colleges in some particular places there. So one of the things we've been working on was to get a match in the endowment fund. So that means there's a fund so that when we get a gift in, we will get a match from this fund. So that's about $2.5 million for the community colleges there. That hasn't been done in over a decade. So it was good to see that come in. There was also $1.5 million put in the Workforce Incentive Fund. So again, this really helps us to go out to our employers and say, here's some workforce dollars that we can help you with the training. There was also $5 million put in for campus safety and cybersecurity. So that's going to help all the community colleges really be more secure and to work on cybersecurity. We also saw $5 million for early college that was put in the Governor Baker's supplemental filing just recently. So Governor Baker is going to speak again tonight in his State of the State address. I was invited down to meet with Secretary Peister last week to talk about some of the things that are going to be in there, and they also took the PowerPoint back afterwards, right? So they're really keeping that under their hat. There is going to be a program for career and technical vocational high schools, but it looks like it's all positive for the community colleges in there. There's still more we would like to get for the community colleges, but this is not should be something that will help us as well as helping them. Another thing I wanted to point out is we started work funding on our biotech lab. That's underway. That's a big project, and that's just an amazing program that we're really excited about continuing to build that out. We've also purchased customer relations management, or CRM software, that will be used by admissions. And again, longer term, as we get this in place, this is really going to help us more effectively and efficiently connect and track our students as we go out into the community, as we reach out to people. This way we will have them in a system that's accessible right from the start. We can do more effective marketing and outreach to them. So I think that's really exciting. We'll extend this service later across the campus. Also, we did some major upgrades to our testing centers to really support our multiple measures testing, and also to bring in some other testing that we could do there as well. And we now have a CSO, Davis Murillo, here. That's a Chief Security Officer. And we are going to have a cybersecurity advisory group. So that will be really good to help us stay on top of this. One thing we are going to continue with again is really focus on our equity agenda. And there is a tremendous amount being done on the campus to eliminate barriers for all our students here. And this is really a priority of the Board of Education and the Commissioner this year, and it's something that a lot of work has been done on this campus. We have groups like Leading for Change, L4C, that's led by Darcy Oriana. And this group is really working to build an equity-minded culture here at MCC, and they had some great meetings last week that I went to. It's really inspirational to see the work they're doing and how they're approaching making sure we reach out to everyone. The Strategic Planning Committee has also really incorporated equity into their agenda. You'll be hearing more about that from Susan Anderson and Haley Sugarman later today. And SODL, led by Kathy McCarran and Sally Quast, has also done a lot with 100% success to really think about how do we make sure that we have an equity-minded culture that closes those gaps for everybody. And last, I was proud to really represent the college at the MCC conference. They asked us, because of the work we're doing, to come in and present on the equity work we were doing. I was paired with Wellesley College, an institution that's just like ours, and it was interesting how similar all the work we're doing is. Okay, moving forward, we're going to really continue the improvements we've been working on across the campus with the technology, with the processes, with the training. We really are trying to, keep that agenda going to make us more efficient and more effective, particularly on the back end of the college with what we do. We're also continuing to upgrade our education spaces. That's really important. And also our spaces for faculty and staff and some of our meeting spaces. These are the things we're going to continue to work through the task force and to really get this lined up so that we really can make sure that all our facilities in all our rooms are really up to standard here. Strategic, also what we're working on is Middle Street and trying to make this our STEM hub in Lowell. We've been talking about this for a couple of years now. We're working on finding the resources to build out the Pollard building, where we can really make this a focus of one side of the street, biological sciences, physical sciences on the other. We've got our health sciences down there. It would really be great. We're not going to neglect this campus. They're both really important, but we're going to be working on that one first. Strategic planning is moving along nicely, and we're going to hear more, as I said, about that later. And we're starting to put together a task force to redesign our website and bring in a vendor to help us do that. So that's going to be an important, large project here. And we all know it's time for our website to go through an overhaul. It's the end of that cycle. Okay. Also coming up, we have the 50th anniversary next fall. I'm going to talk about that more in a minute. And really, after we go through this, we have the website all ready to go. We've got our strategic goals and objectives all put together. We've been through our 50th anniversary. It's really time to think about a rebranding campaign and think about where the college is going for the next decade. Okay, so 50th anniversary. This is going to be a lot of fun next year. The 50th year of colleges starting at the college, September 24th, I think it is exactly. And so that's really, we're going to have things going on all semester. So really, the goal here is, one, first to celebrate our rich history. And we really have a tremendous amount to be proud of at this college. Many of you have been here for years and have really built a legacy of excellence and access and success here. And this is something we really want to celebrate, which will also help us raise awareness of the college and all the good work we do out in the community. And I think this is really a wonderful opportunity for us to really key off of that and do a tremendous amount of marketing work out in the community. So we're all pulling together to do this. We're also going to use this year to really build our alumni association. We have about 200 active members now, and we'd like to take that to 1,000 over the next 18 months. So we really have some ambitious goals here of what we'd like to do, not just increase awareness about the college, but really build that long-term connections from our alumni. And this is a date to put on your calendars. Okay, next fall, October 17th, we're going to have a big homecoming on this campus, and this will be a lot to do next year. So there's going to be a lot going on, and we'll be getting more information out to you. There's a committee working on this. We welcome new ideas. We're trying to bring in as much as we can to make this an exciting year at the college. Okay. Yes. We have a question.
Yeah, you have a question.
Sure.
Wondering with the update to the website, we also talked about the department support for department web pages, other things.
Absolutely. I mean, it's one of the key things we talked about is how do we support this all longer term, right? Because it's not just doing a refresh and having the information there once. It's how do we really think about this longer term? So that's a key point. Do we have to think, how do we maintain this? How do we have a system to maintain this over the long haul? And I think we'll look to some of the best practices out there, but again, adapted to the circumstances at MCC. But ideas in that would be great. You know, would we love to have, a lot more staffing helping out with that? Sure, but, again, it's tight, but we'll try to figure out the best way to do it. Okay. Is there anything else there before we head on? Okay, so to keep it rolling here then, we are going to have a keynote speaker, Evan Borkman. All right, Evan joined the General Counsel's office in 2019. He received his BA in Government and Philosophy from Skidmore, JD from Western New England College, University School of Law. He served as interim director of the General Counsel's office for the Massachusetts Office of Disabilities. In addition, he also has been working in private practice. Evan worked for over 3 years at Western New England University General Counsel's office. He has extensive experience in employment, discrimination, higher education, and especially disability law. So I'm going to have Evan come up in a minute. He is going to give a presentation, and then we're going to have a panelist. As we can see, the list is up here. They'll talk a little bit about how we are addressing accessibility issues here at MCC. So at this point, I'd like to bring Evan up.
Excellent. Thank you, Dr. Mabry. Thank you all for having me here today. I really appreciate this opportunity to hopefully be able to share some of my knowledge with everyone here. I've been with the office for about a year now, prior to serving as the General Counsel of the Massachusetts Office on Disability. Probably three of the biggest areas that I've worked in over the years and areas in which I get asked to speak on are, number one, around disability service animals and emotional support animals. Number two, around medical marijuana and how that relates to disability and disability discrimination protection. And number three is the really biggest area, which is website and digital accessibility. So, as I said, oftentimes these are the three biggest areas that I work in, but this is probably across the board, without a doubt, the least area that I get asked to speak on. And I think that is because this is a hard topic to address. It's very nuanced, it's very unclear, and there are a lot of moving parts to it depending on our students, depending on our population. So I commend the college for, and I thank the college for having me here, and I'm happy to take questions at the end today. And without further ado, I'm going to go through sort of the history around digital accessibility, why it's so difficult, why there is at least some clarity, and how we know that, and most importantly at the end, how do we get to an answer, how do we get to assisting our students, our employees, and members of the general public. There's one thing I'm going to ask today. I know after a 3-day weekend, you coming here today and listening may be a difficult thing to do. But what I'm hoping for is that everyone here really would try your best to take one thing away from this in the positive. Right? Digital accessibility, website accessibility, it's easy to get bogged down around some of the difficulties out there. It's easy to get bogged down around working with our employees, the general public, some of our students. But if you can take one positive thing away here and apply it to what you do, hopefully my job will be done here today. So, higher education institutions, why do I like this area as an attorney? I like it because it's very, very complex, right? There's a lot of moving parts, just like with digital accessibility. But to sort of set the stage here today, I want to kind of lay out the legalities of who we're talking about here today as far as members of the public, right? That is an entity that we serve. Another area that we talk about when we deal with everything with them is that we are employers. The college is an employer, and there's obligations that go with that employment. And most importantly, places of education, right? We have obligations to our students, whether we're a public entity or whether we're a private organization, and we're open to the public, like private, like Wesley College or Wesleyan College. It's important to know that depending on these particular areas, there's going to be different obligations. And certain areas, depending on the guidance and the type of laws that are out there, they're further ahead than other areas, right? So as we move through this, it may seem at times confusing as far as, well, why is there a clarity on this issue related to us as an employer, but none related to us as of our students? Well, the reality is because there are various laws that operate in different ways. There's various guidance and enforcement agencies that are responsible for those particular areas. So setting the stage there, again, expecting that there is going to be a lack of clarity, expecting that there are going to be different obligations depending on these areas, hopefully we'll give a better understanding of what we're going to talk about today. All right, so disability, right? There's varying estimates around disability and what is the population of persons with disabilities, okay? And a lot of that has to do, by the way, with the fact that when we take population surveys, when surveys get conducted, various populations that have limitations very well may not be properly represented in those surveys. Right, so compared to other protected categories like race and gender, where we can determine what the layout is and how much percentage those folks are compared to the whole population, we don't have that with disability. Right? There's guesstimates around either 5 to around 27% of the working population are persons with disabilities. So one of the important things I think is to lay out right now, what are we talking about when we're talking about persons with disabilities related to higher education, related to digital accessibility, right? There's definitions for disability that are related to, for example, handicap parking, right? And that really focuses on one's ability, for example, to ambulate or to move, right? There's another definition, for example, of disability for SSDI, or disability insurance. And that really focuses on one's limitations and what jobs are available in the general public. Today, when we're talking about disability, we're talking about the widest population and the widest definition of disability. It's the civil rights definition of disability. All right, I think that's, again, important to lay out. Oftentimes we get questions in my old office around, well, I am permanently disabled by SSDI, right? And when we're talking about, civil rights definitions, that's what we're talking about today. And so what is it? It's a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activity. It also includes folks that have a record of such an impairment or being regarded as having such an impairment. You may say, well, if they don't have those impairments, why would they be protected if they're not necessarily limited based on the first two prongs of those definitions? Well, the whole point there is that if we're regarding or we're treating someone as a person with a disability, they should be protected under the laws as such, even though they may not necessarily meet those first definitions. Also notice, physical or mental impairment, there's no list of disabilities, right? In the ADA came out, there was, in an antiquated sort of way, an understanding of certain disorders and diseases that would automatically meet the definition of disability. That was adjusted to be much more broad, right? So when we receive medical documentation, for example, we're not always looking at or looking for a particular disease or disorder. That's not required under the law. Also put in there substantially limits. Oftentimes throughout case law, it's been argued that substantially limits means completely limited. Or very heavily limited. The ADA looks at substantially limits as being limited compared to someone in the general public who doesn't have a disability. All right? So again, this is a very easy definition to meet, and it is because of, and I'll go through Section 504 of the Rehab Act definition. I'm not going to spend much time on that, but I listed that here for you as far as one of the obligations under that law, which we'll go into those laws in a moment. So the definition, I said no exhaustive list of major life activities, but here are the big ones, right? So if someone is substantially limited in their ability to work or to learn or to stand, they may be protected under the ADA, right? However, in 2010, the ADA Amendments Act expanded the definition for disability to include major bodily functions, all right? And what do I want you to focus on? If someone is substantially limited in one of these major bodily functions, it's not going to be obvious to you, right? That's one of the takeaways I want you to see here. Oftentimes we get into situations where certain folks don't believe that someone is a person with a disability because it doesn't look that way, or because they don't have a physical limitation that may be clear to the eye. Doesn't matter in the eyes of the law, all right? They're still protected under the Americans with Disabilities Act. And the expansion of this definition to include major bodily functions was really because of people like myself as attorneys, right? Because certain defense lawyers were making the argument for a long period of time of if I don't meet this definition on the last page of disability, then me as an employer, me as a higher education institution, me as an entity that's open to the public, I have no obligations to this person if they don't meet the disability definition. Right? So there's certain case law that required Congress to make this definition more broad, with the understanding that we don't want to focus on meeting this definition. We want to make it very, very easy to meet this definition, and we want you instead to be focusing on how we're going to accommodate someone, how we're going to work with someone, what are our obligations once we get past that barrier of meeting that definition. All right, so again, broadest definition of disability, that's what we're talking about, civil rights definition of disability today. All right. So web accessibility, certain folks very well may know a little bit about what web accessibility means, but I kind of want to go into a little bit right now what that actually means, especially in the higher education context. All right, accessibility, wow, what is accessibility? We know what physical accessibility means. Everyone understands the ramp concepts. Everyone understands those types of things, but what are we talking about when we refer to web accessibility? One of the things that I like to go into is the various technologies, when we say compatible with assistive technology, and sort of that will sort of help out with this understanding, the various types of technologies that are utilized in the way that websites need to work with those technologies. So one of the types of technologies is screen reading technology. Right? And that's utilized for someone who has significant visual limitations. And what it does is it's basically a software that goes onto the computer. It's a non-visual cursor, and that cursor goes through a web page or a document based on that person's toggling of the keyboard. And what it does is it actually reads and orates back to them through speakers. So you can imagine if the underlying basis of that website is reading in a different order, or someone is unable to tab or move into those areas of the websites, if someone can't see, they're not going to know they're missing information. They're not going to know that the information is bumbo-jumbo or messed up or not correct as far as the bottom line. All right? Another area of technology is speech-to-text software. Right? So a website should be working with your types of technology like Dragon, right? What is that? That's when you speak into something, it's the opposite, and then it types out. So again, if the website isn't built correctly, or the browser isn't working correctly, it's not going to work. Another area is very similar to the JAWS software for someone who very well may not be as limited in sight. And that type of technology proprietarily is called Zoom text. And what does it do? It allows an individual to make changes to the contrast on a web page. So for example, if there's a gray background and there's yellow text, Someone with limited vision very well may not be able to see that information. So this software allows them to change that to, for example, black and white. Right? Another thing that that technology allows someone to do is to, based on its name, zoom into various areas and be able to look at those areas in such a way that they're able to see that. The final area that I talk about of accessibility and how we know that something is accessible is if you're able to use a keyboard only. And why do we say, when you said, Evan, we're talking about visual limitations and disabilities, well, we're also talking about, as I mentioned, all the types of disabilities and how folks interact with those web pages, right? And so one of the great ways to check if your website or your page is accessible is by only using a keyboard and tabbing through and using the arrows to go through. Because there are folks out there that may be limited in motor skills and being able to use a mouse, right? So one of the ways we look at is keyboard only use, all right? So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about utilizing with web accessibility and assistive technology, right? And as I've listed here, there are other things. For example, captioning audio or having images that have alternative text. Well, you say, Evan, what is alternative text? I've never heard of that term. Basically, if we type that person who uses JAWS software and scrolls through a page, if they get to a picture, if they're blind, they're not going to know what that picture is. So there's a way of putting text behind that picture to read out what that picture is to someone who's utilizing that technology. All right? And the industry standard, I put this guidance here, is WCAG. Those are the technical standards on how you build a web page or how you build other types of digital technology to sort of operate with those technologies and assistive technologies that I just mentioned. It's one of the types of standards that are out there, and we'll go into that because I think that's important from an enforcement standpoint. Scope of digital accessibility. So I keep mentioning, and I'm wrong here, I keep mentioning web pages, right? And saying website, web page accessibility. But what is the scope of digital accessibility? The reality is that the obligations relate to all of our programs, activities, and services, including those services that are digital in nature, right? So with websites, often folks think that we're responsible for our content that's on that web page and that's it. However, enforcement and lawsuits have taught us that that's not necessarily the entire scope of what we're talking about. We're also referring to the documents that are on those pages. We're referring to oftentimes the links that go to external content. Right? We've seen a lot of enforcement activity in those areas saying that if those are not accessible, well then it's the same thing as saying that your website itself is not accessible. Another area that's utilized often nowadays is kiosks. Right? I often did a lot of work with organizations that had digital kiosks. And they said, well, listen, this is not a website, so we're not ultimately responsible for it. The reality is the same obligations around how we're going to build accessibility into our websites relate to anything that is digital. And in fact, in my personal opinion, I would say that those obligations are even higher. Because oftentimes when we have kiosks, we don't have other ways to reach out to someone to help us out if that isn't working for us, right? Another area that is large these days is mobile applications. Everyone's rushing to create mobile applications that are based on their websites or based on the other things that folks have. We're seeing it all the time now with the city of Boston and the payment of parking tickets, right? And how someone's able to do that. Well, the same legal obligations around technical accessibility relate to that as well. Social media. Social media we'll talk about later for particular cases around accessibility. The great thing is the majority of social media platforms do have accessibility features built into them, but oftentimes they're not utilized correctly. These last three, testing software and applications, so we utilize software oftentimes to perform the testing for what we do, course assignment databases, and I'm not just talking about course assignments, I'm talking about how folks turn those assignments in, how we interact with our students and the general public, and also distance learning technologies. These are three things that higher education institutions have made claims that, well, we're not ultimately responsible for these. We utilize them, we contract with them, but we're not ultimately responsible. The reality is, regardless of where that responsibility lands, someone is ultimately responsible for making those technologies accessible to our employers, our employees, our students, and members of the general public. All right, so applicable laws and enforcement agencies. I'm sorry, I typically get very parched up here. I know it's painful to watch. It's not painful. Just get very dry mouth, so my apologies for that. Oftentimes, and so I'm a lawyer and I can say this, I don't always, I'll be very honest with you, specifically remember specific names of laws and how they play out. Maybe in this area, but not everywhere else. And you want to know what? That's okay. That's okay, because that allows me to understand and hear and contemplate way more than I would if I remembered specific laws. One of my favorite professors in law school said you can get an A on my exam by not mentioning any laws as long as you can articulate what the principle is underneath that law relative to what we're looking for. All right? So although there are really two laws that we're going to be talking about a lot today, the Americans with Disabilities Act that relates to employment, relates to all state and local governments and entities, and public accommodations, which are your private organizations, your private hospitals, your private colleges that are open to the general public. And we're going to be talking about Section 504 of the Rehab Act, which relates to specifically your receipt of federal funding. I'm not too concerned about how folks remember those laws. I do think it's important today to understand what are the enforcement agencies for those laws. Okay? Keep in mind that before you go to court, before a claimant goes to court oftentimes, they've got to go through one of these enforcement agencies. The case needs to sit there for a portion of time. All right? So this oftentimes gives us very good guidance on looking at these cases and looking at the guidance that these organizations give. And there's three big ones. One is the EEOC, and that's related to employment. All right, and the obligations there too. The other one is the U.S. Department of Education, Office of Civil Rights. All right, and that is an organization that public higher education institutions work with around enforcement in this particular area. And the Department of Justice that often works with private colleges and universities. Although it's pretty interesting because the Department of Justice sometimes and the Office of Civil Rights, Department of Education will go and deal with other types of cases. Why? Because of Section 504 of the Rehab Act. As I mentioned, if those entities, private higher education institutions, receive federal funding, which they all do, okay, whether they like it to admit that or not, they do receive those fundings, or their students receive that funding, they may be dealing with one of these enforcement agencies. So again, if you can just remember the enforcement agencies, hopefully that'll help you out as we move through the enforcement activities there too. Another funny little ditty here, an interesting point. Section 504 of the Rehab Act, you may think to yourself, well, all public organizations, all public higher education institutions receive federal funding, right? So why do we need this Title II of the ADA, state and local governments? Those same lawyers that were making the arguments that I mentioned before around undermining the disability definition and therefore saying we don't have any obligations to those folks, were making the arguments that, sure, maybe part of our education institution receives federal funding, but this other portion that we're talking about today does not, right? So when the ADA came into existence after Section 504 of the Rehab Act, the whole point there was Title II, if you're a state and local government entity, regardless of what funding you receive, you're responsible under the ADA. Right? Also important to note that the non-discrimination provisions around equal opportunity and access and the duty to accommodate, which we'll go into shortly, are basically analogous to both of them, right? So 504 and ADA basically say the same thing, right? So one of the things that we often lack in a disability area, and disability discrimination, is clarity. Right? We often lack the clarity that we need around how we're supposed to be operating. It's very easy, and I think a lot of folks want to know, I want to have an FAQ. I want to know how I'm supposed to deal with this situation when it comes to me every single time. And the reality is that these laws, the ADA and Section 504, they're not built that way. Right? That's not the purpose of them. The purpose is that we're supposed to do individualized assessments on a case-by-case basis on how we're going to accommodate and work with our students. All right? And our members of that interact with our education institutions. The also other piece of it is that there's an affirmative obligation to act. So for example, these websites, when we're talking about websites, we have an affirmative obligation to act and create these websites in such a way that our students and our employees and members of the general public can work. All right? One of the things that I was very excited about in 2012, however, is that there were going to be regulations that specifically mandated website accessibility and the technical standards in those regulations. And I said, wow, this is great. We finally have some clarity around specifically how we're going to build these websites. And that was in 2012, right? And what was the whole basis of that? The whole basis of that was that the Department of Justice understood that higher education institutions were utilizing digital technology to do the job of what they were doing before, right? We work with our students, we have course assignments, we interact with them, we provide them information, we teach them, right? And instead of just doing that face-to-face, we're now doing that more through digital technology, so there's a need, right? And so in 2012, through the regulatory process, so just so you know how that goes, regulations get filed, the public comments on them, they make some adjustments to them, and then they go into effect. Unfortunately, that's not what happened here. In 2012, both of them, the regulations were filed for private entities open to the public and state and local governments. And in 2017, those regulations were put on the inactive list. All right? Why is that the case? I'm not quite sure. Part of my understanding of it is that when you put something into regulation, especially if it's a technical standard, there may be issues around that because the regulatory process only happens every decade plus. And therefore, we have technical standards listed in there. It may be difficult to sort of address that going forward. However, bottom line, those same lawyers that I keep referring to are now, because of the lack of guidance and regulation around the technical standards, making the arguments that if you don't have technical standards for us to follow, you, one, don't intend for us to follow those, and two, how are we supposed to know what's out there in order to make our websites and digital accessibility accessible? Those are the arguments that are going out there, okay? Now what I'm going to refer to now are the really big four areas of how we know that we as a higher education institution can be responsible for a failure to create digital accessibility in an accessible format, even though there aren't specific regulations out there, right? Even though there's case law here, when we look at the Robles versus Domino's Pizza, that is making the claim that there's no guidance out there and therefore we have nothing to follow, I'm making the case, and the very good case that I believe, that there are really four areas around how we make these things accessible, how we make all digital accessibility accessible. All right? And what it really starts out with here is that we look at the overarching pillars, the overarching legal obligations of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And one of the things that it says is that the ADA requires equal access, full participation, access to all benefits, and we can't discriminate against persons with disabilities. Well, if we go back to those four areas of folks that are using assistive technology, and we look at a website and we determine that someone doesn't have access to that information, well, now we're in a situation where we're not giving equal access, where we are necessarily discriminating against persons with disabilities. right? So what I'm trying to do is explain that even though there's not technical standards that are required, there are violations when we fail to create digital accessibility. The other piece that these enforcement agencies that I mentioned are hanging their hat on is the requirement of effective communication. And what does that mean? That's an obligation of the ADA that says everything that we communicate to persons without disabilities, we ultimately, and I'm summarizing here, need to communicate that to persons with visual auditory disabilities. So there we go. If a website, someone doesn't have access to that because of their disability, we're on the hook here because of this effective communication standard. I mentioned this before, the ADA departs from other anti-discrimination statutes by requiring affirmative steps to ensure access by persons with disabilities. Why I love this area of the law is that I think it is the most complex area with regard to discrimination. You can discriminate against a person with a disability like you can anyone else that's in the protected category of age or gender or national origin or immigration status. You can do that same thing to a person with a disability. However, unlike any other area of the law, short of religious accommodations, there's an affirmative obligation when we refer to persons with disabilities to accommodate and to modify policies, practices, and procedures. And if we fail to do that, in theory, it amounts to the same type of discrimination as if we say you can't come in here because you're a person with a disability. All right? Being very general with that, but I think it's really important because folks oftentimes don't recognize that obligation, when we fail to listen to a student, when we fail to take one of their disability claims or one of their issues, we fail to communicate with them through the interactive process, it amounts to the same type of discrimination. So again, there's another portion that we can look at, how we know we have these obligations. Also, everyone likes to mention, well, the ADA never contemplated digital anything. Right? It was 1990, the internet was barely invented, even if it was, right? But when we look at the law, it refers to auxiliary aids and technology and accessible electronic information and technology, right? So these enforcement agencies are building ground here and saying that these obligations still apply. And finally, I mentioned before, there's a technical standard here on how to build technical and digital accessibility, and it's the WCAG 2.0 technical standards. One of the enforcement agencies got in trouble a couple years ago because they were mandating in their enforcement and settlement agreements that people have to use WCAG 2.0. As we know, based on the failure for regulations to be passed mandating that as a requirement, these enforcement agencies had to take a step back and say, okay, maybe we don't necessarily use WCAG 2.0, but there's other technical standards that are out there that need to be used. And again, the enforcement agencies understand that regardless of what you're using and what technical standard, you need to pick one, you need to go with it. Oh, and by the way, we know that there's a way to make this content accessible. All right, so even though we don't have regulations, what's the big takeaway here? We know that the requirements are there. And now we're going to kind of go into the four big areas where we see this happen. All right, and I've cherry-picked a couple cases. And the first area is agreements. Either the consent agreements or settlement agreements. And I mentioned in the various categories. So litigation, those are court cases. DOE, OCR, Office of Civil Rights cases, Department of Justice cases, and the final one being employment cases. And the first case I'll talk about very briefly here is Toth versus Florida State. And the claim here was that a particular student was unable to access course content software from home to be able to utilize their homework, to be able to do their homework, and in class, they were unable to actively participate because one of the formats for answering questions was a clicker, all right, and a clicker based on who clicked it first and how they were able to then answer the questions. And these technologies, the claim goes, were inaccessible, all right? So through litigation, through court, there was a settlement agreement here. Those two students were each given around $75,000 through this case, and Florida State was mandated than to remove the clicking software and also to create this homework software in a more accessible format. Notice here, and one of the important things why I bring this case up, is that this was for a STEM course. All right? So oftentimes people will make the argument that, well, we can't make math accessible, we can't make science accessible. And that very well may be the case in certain regards. But the reality is that's not a blanket protection to utilizing inaccessible software to do your homework or to participate in course. The next one will be Atlantic Cape Cod Community College. I tried to do as many community colleges as I possibly could. I thought it was appropriate here. And a consent decree. What's the difference between a consent decree and a settlement agreement? Lawyers always making things confusing. Consent decrees often need to be approved by the court, right? They'll still keep that case open. The court needs to approve that. The benefit there is that they can oftentimes monitor they can monitor that case. So in this case, Atlantic Cape Community College, a student filed the case in saying that because of fire code issues, this individual was blind, they weren't able to come to the classroom for a short period of time. And one of the claims of that student was that I asked for my documents that I was unable to have access to because I wasn't there in person to be scanned digitally so that I have access to that content. And the faculty member did not do that or did not reach out to another entity of the college that could help them out. And therefore, in this case in particular, just because there was a failure to create that accessible digital document, there was a settlement agreement and there was money paid. The next one would be Dudley versus University of Miami. And in this one, this individual made the claim that there was inaccessible course management software. And one of the resolutions here was that this person had to create software and create a management coursework software that was accessible and utilize that going forward. The next case here, DOE OCR, is a case between a student and the University of Eastern Oregon. That was a resolution agreement. This was specifically around this issue of keyboard accessibility. The website and course management software was not accessible to a keyboard-only user, and therefore there was a claim and there was a settlement and resolution agreement required just because of that keyboard accessibility. So nothing to do with any other type of accessibility technology. The next one, University of Pennsylvania. The only reason I bring this one up, University of Pennsylvania is a private organization. However, the Office of Civil Rights dealt with this case. Why? They dealt with it because University of Pennsylvania utilizes public funds. Right? So as I mentioned, some of these enforcement agencies very well may go into and deal with colleges that they typically don't deal with. The next one would be a Department of Justice settlement agreement with MIT and Harvard in their utilization of edX software. And in this one, really simple. Again, we're talking about technical accessibility. Yes, it's very nuanced. Yes, it's very hard sometimes. In this particular case, these organizations put out content that was not captioned. It's as simple as that, right? And therefore, the Department of Justice stepped in. I'll talk about later. They actually filed a particular guidance document in this court case, but that was all it related to, the failure to caption particular content. The next one is the letter to Chancellor Dirks, and this is a case against the University of California, Berkeley. And why do I bring this particular case up? This one is around inaccessible videos that were not even for their students. It was put out to the general public on their websites, and the claim here is that from Berkeley, well listen, we have no obligations here because it's not for our employees and it's not for our students. Right? And as I mentioned from earlier on, we have obligations to the general public, and that's what the Department of Justice made very clear here. Even if the content is not specific to courses, not specific to your students or your employees, you still have obligations here. And the final one, and I put EEOC in a question mark here, that's the one enforcement agency, remember that's the Employment Administrative Enforcement Agency, does not necessarily take an official position on requiring website accessibility. right? What are they saying? They're basically saying, well, we don't want to deal with the technical standard issue. We only care if you don't accommodate your employees, we're going to step in regardless of whether it's a service animal, regardless of whether it's digital accessibility. We're not going to get into the nuance of what that is. If you're not doing what you're supposed to be doing, we're going to go through that. We're not going to take an official position on it. But I thought this one was really important because this is a particular guidance counselor who was unable to use school systems, websites, web forums, and software. And this settlement agreement was for around $250,000 and a requirement that all those digital options be made accessible. All right, so that's the one big area, settlement agreements, decrees. The other one is statements of interest and agency guidance. I'm going to spend a very brief portion on time here. Just know that from 2003 to 2018, every one of those entities, short of the EEOC, so the Department of Justice, the Office of Civil Rights, has put out a plethora of guidance around what are the obligations and how can we help you make these things accessible, whatever it is. All right, it's all out there. I will mention here, you'll see that NAD versus Harvard and MIT case, statement of interest. The Department of Justice has a very, and all these enforcement agencies have a very small budget around stepping in on cases and saying, this is our official position. They do it very, very frequently. Why? Because they're so busy dealing with all the cases that they have from enforcement. However, they made it a very big priority that they stepped in on this Harvard versus MIT case. Remember, that's the captioning case, right? And made the claim that legally this is the requirement. If someone doesn't have access to this content, they can't see it, they can't read it, they're ultimately on the hook. We'll help you out with the technical side of things. That's the second big area. The third area that we'll talk about today is laws for other areas, right? Laws in other areas. And you may make the claim of, again, like these lawyers make the claim, well, these are laws in other areas, so we have no obligations here. The reality is that these obligations oftentimes exist in enforcement activities under the ADA, Section 504 of the Rehab Act. Section 508 of the Rehab Act requires all federal entities to create electronic information and information technology in an accessible format. Doesn't relate to entities that receive federal funding, it just relates to federal entities. So the federal government, generally, by and large, full accessibility with regard to all their digital accessibility. These other two laws relate to, generally speaking, our obligations to communicate through telephones, and what are those obligations to make that technology accessible. But the important one here at the end that I like to refer to is the Air Carrier Access Act. And that is promulgated through Department of Transportation regulations and says that all websites for airlines and 25% of their kiosks need to be accessible to persons with disabilities. Right, so the movement, what's the point here, Evan? You're saying, again, these laws don't relate to what we do every single day. The reality is that it's moving in that direction, right? And we see it in other areas. The obligations are there. The technical guidance is there. And that's what enforcement agencies are looking to. And the final area is the litigation, right? So many lawsuits I mentioned, the EEOC has not taken official position on employment and what are the digital accessibility requirements to our employees. However, there's a myriad of cases that are getting filed right now. What's the argument? Regardless of whatever the accessibility issues are, our employees can't operate, they can't work, they can't do their jobs every single day. All right? Note that website accessibility cases, they're going through the roof. All right, there's a myriad of cases that are being filed. They wouldn't be filed unless they're getting traction, right? Lawyers aren't going to work for free. Okay? So there are a couple circuit courts where these cases have gone up to. Another little funny thing is people often say, I want to take my case to the Supreme Court, right? I got a parking lot, I'm taking that thing all the way up. The reality is the majority of cases that go to the Supreme Court, probably 95% of them, aren't around those types of cases. They're all around various circuit courts deciding federal laws differently, and the Supreme Court needs to step in and address that. The Supreme Court has not stepped in and addressed that at this point. We're still in the infancy of some of these cases. And note that digital accessibility cases, not only are they being filed, they're end over end, they are being increased year over year at the percentage of these types of disability discrimination cases and digital accessibility and how much they're taking up of those cases. I put these Payan and Mason versus Los Angeles Community College case. You say, because again, I thought it was important for the community colleges. And what was that case based on? It was based on an inaccessible handbook from a faculty member, a website inaccessibility issue, and library databases being accessible. Remember, really large scope here. Anything related to digital that we do is under the auspices required for us to do this. Now, you may ask again, what can we take away from all this, right? Looking at all these settlement agreements, looking at the other areas, looking at litigation, looking at the federal enforcement agency guidance, what do we ultimately know over here? And that's why I've sort of pulled together a list of what can we take away here, right? We can take away that the color combinations and the text that we utilize needs to be accessible. We understand that keyboard-only use is a very important thing for checking and requirements around digital accessibility. Skip navigation and captioning of videos and alternative text needs to be done in a meaningful way, right? So we mentioned that image before and someone scrolling over it, not being able to see it, and putting text behind it. Well, if that text doesn't make sense, or it's not descriptive enough, or it's not meaningful enough, we're still failing to meet that obligation. Another one is, and this is something, a lot of the work that I did around the mass.gov website was, we got a whole bunch of content here on this website, and we've got all these obligations to make it accessible. And what is one of the easiest ways to make sure that job is easier? Well, we have a bunch of antiquated information on our websites, and the obligations apply to that antiquated information, but no one's utilizing it. So one of the things we can do is eliminate information that we're not using anymore on our websites, on the documents, so that we don't have to create that in an accessible format, right? I've also mentioned some of the technical requirements here, labeling all headings, links and forms, and that's basically, again, someone utilizes that JAWS technology to scan through a page. If the headings, if links that someone clicks onto do not read descriptively and accurately as to what the content is behind that link, right? We see what a link says, we can create a hyperlink, we can put whatever we want over that hyperlink, but if someone scans over that with their JAWS technology and it's not accurate, again, they're not getting that information, or we're not meeting that effective communication standard under the ADA. Another one I mentioned here, and I think this is an important one for higher education institutions who utilize social media technology, as they should, for a myriad of reasons for their students and for employees in getting that information out there. As I mentioned, the majority of these social media platforms have digital accessibility as an option, and you can utilize it. The problem comes in when multiple people have access to that social media and they're not doing it in a uniform sort of fashion, right? So this is a twofold issue. There's obligations to do things the right way, and there's obligations to, as we move into the second and final page here, around how we need to make sure that we're all on the same page and we're doing it the same way. Right? So what can we take away as I come into the conclusion here? We want to really make the affirmation like we're doing here today, and making sure that this is an important thing here on campus. We want to make a statement, and again, I mentioned I very rarely get asked to speak on this, even though it is a huge topic that I work on all the time, because I think a lot of folks, they don't want to touch it, they don't understand it. That's not the case here. You know, the college is taking this very seriously. They're making a statement. They're trying to address this. One of the other areas I often recommend is an auditor, right? An auditor to sort of look at the content that's thereon. Like I mentioned, making adjustments to that content, removing antiquated content. Another one would be, and I think this is the biggest one, right? And because this comes up all the time, We don't want to be fighting a two-front war, right? We have a website, we have digital accessibility obligations to all the technologies that we utilize, and we need to address that, as Dr. Mabry said, going forward with a new website. Well, the other portion of it is, I think there was a question back there around how are we going to add content there too, and how do we have a process set up to make sure and ensure that that content is added, is accessible, right? And that's an important thing that I recommend and I advise on around maybe only certain folks who are trained to add that content have the ability to add that on. And that doesn't mean that not everyone, not all faculty can add content to the website. It just means that it's got to go through someone who has the ability and the savviness to make sure that that content is accessible. Also mentioned here, creating a corrective action plan to prioritize the removal of online barriers, right? One of the greatest things in accessibility and disability law is the fact that these organizations, these enforcement organizations, understand that not everything is going to be perfect, and not everything is going to be done 100% correct. Right? And that is magnified in digital accessibility because, as I've mentioned, we're in the infancy of digital accessibility. Not to mention there's various other factors around the different types of technology, the mode that technology gets utilized in, and more importantly, for example, the website browsers that people are utilizing may ultimately affect the bottom line basis of that accessibility. Right? The point is, how do we have a priority? What are the programs, activities, and services digitally that we utilize the most? Right? And prioritize that and work our way back from that. All right? So generally, I kind of skipped over a few here. I know we're running out of time. I wanted to thank everyone here today. Again, I want to harken back to what I said before. If there's something that you can take away from this and some sort of understanding, some sort of way that you have analyzed this before, that we have these obligations. There's a way to meet accessibility. There's a way that at the bottom line, even if we can't meet the technical accessibility requirements, I always advise that we have a process as a backdrop to make sure that we're getting that content to our students, to our employees, folks in the general public. And so hopefully someone and you folks out there can take away from what we've talked about today. I don't know if we have some time here before we pull the panel up, but I'd be happy to answer some questions. Yes?
Hi, everyone. Hi, I'm Joanna Delmonico. I'm in the math department. So I just had two quick questions. So there was a case where can everyone hear me?
I think we should have that.
Accessibility issue.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. David, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, so I have two questions. The first one was the case where videos that were put up by Berkeley
Yep.
for public consumption.
Yep.
So I'm curious, being devil's advocate, so did they just say, oh, all right, and take them down? I mean, could a place decide, okay, we're just not going to put those videos out to the whole public because they're not accessible?
Sure. And I think in that case, they said, well, listen, I think part of how we're getting people coming to our school, even though it's Cal Berkeley, and it's probably not hard to get people to, well, we want to put that content out there.
Right.
And I think what they said was, I think my whole takeaway from that case is that captioning is very, very easy to do. And so
So that
correct,
would
sure,
could that create a situation where it actually impedes accessibility to the whole public because they say, well, we don't want to play that game, we're just going to pull that down. The second one was, I have to read. We've had all the cases that you've shown where compliance was necessary. Do we have any examples where maybe a case has been brought and then it was deemed that, well, you know, in this instance, the compliance isn't going to be able to be brought up to standard? So sort of the other side of the coin. I think that would be interesting.
Sure, I think there are specific, I think they're rare, and I think there may be specific cases where that ultimately may be the case. I think what they're going to say is maybe digitally we're unable to give folks access to this information, but ultimately if it's our students, if it's our employees, we're going to still have to find some workaround on how we need to do that. I think courts and enforcement agencies are very don't want to make those overarching statements because I think the point is they don't want to be morphed and utilized in such a way that folks are saying we don't have an obligation to make this content accessible because it can't be done. I think there are cases where certain things have been construed as a fundamental alteration, as an undue burden, but there are not going to be any overarching guidance statements around, hey, you don't have to do this, because ultimately we do have a requirement to get that information to our students, and ultimately there is a way that we're able to do that. So that's why I think, we're talking about STEM issues, we're talking about technology that's there. We're seeing majority, 99.8% of the cases, they're saying that you have to create this content in an accessible format, at least when it comes to the digital availability. And if someone, because of their disability in a specific case-by-case circumstance, can't be a qualified person with a disability, they can't access that information, they can't do the coursework because of their limitations, let's focus on that student rather than the digital requirement. Yes, sir. Can we just wait? Yeah, we're going to take, this is the last question here, and then I'm going to pull it this thing.
Do I have the last word? Is that it? No. If I understood all of this correctly, thank you very much. What I understand of the ADA, we have an obligation to become compliant, or we're going to risk discriminating against our students in the communities we serve, and we're going to risk being liable for lawsuits. Isn't that the case?
Sure.
Yeah, so that means then we need the resources to engage a process for training and for working with our faculty to do online education to get them compliant. We can't expect one or two people to just do it all. And so we do need the resources, just as we get resources to make places physically accessible, we need to make them digitally accessible. That requires resources too. So that means we need a process to become compliant. Otherwise, we will continue discriminating and we will risk liability for lawsuits. So that is correct.
Sure.
Okay, thank you. That was great.
Thank you very much.
I'm Pam Flaherty. I'm the Senior Student Affairs Officer, Dean of Students, and I have the pleasure of overseeing a disability team. And I hope, after hearing what Evan said, that you are going to be very compassionate and caring about that team, because this is what they deal with every single day.
Hey everybody, I'm Joe Pizzuto, the Chief Information Officer here at the college, and just to echo David's comment or question, I think that's the reason we're all here today, is to have a discussion about this collectively, bring in the experts. There's a lot of work that we've done in IT, it's a lot of work you've done in your areas, and this is the start of drafting that plan and providing resources to you all. Some folks think that this is my responsibility in IT, and a lot of it is, but it's also an all-college effort. So I'm happy to hear you bring that forward. And Evan, great discussion today. I feel privileged that you're right across the campus from us.
Thank you.
Beth Noel, Director of Marketing, and just as Joe said, the disability issue often is assigned to IT as of a technology component. And marketing and IT actually work very closely hand in hand on a lot of these issues every day.
Good morning, I'm Elisa Chapman. I'm the Director of Compliance, Title IX and ADA and 504 Coordinator. And so my responsibility is to make sure we have an overarching look at all of the different areas. And so I look at the website accessibility piece, student accommodations, employees, how we're interacting with the general public, making sure our facilities are accessible, and the website. And so it's tying all of those areas together to make sure that we have overall compliance.
Good morning, everybody. Brian Butler, Director of Facilities. A lot of that touches my area, physical, as Evan indicated, facilities is parking, accessing all the bathrooms, classrooms, pathways to get back and forth to your city building. And I live this stuff every day, so.
And I think you folks kind of gave a little summation of what you do in your particular areas, but maybe you folks can kind of go into maybe some examples or one example of what you're doing right now to sort of meet some of the standards and the digital accessibility overarching requirements and pillars that I've mentioned here. And then maybe we can take some questions after that.
I think mine's probably the quickest. What we try to do in the student area, especially at the disability support services, is a lot of proactive. We're always trying to get out there. You've probably heard us over the years, for a number of years, do training on universal design. And the more we can work with folks to incorporate universal design in the way that I always explain it, when you put a wheelchair in for wheelchair access, everybody starts using that ramp. Whether it's moms with kids or whether it's people with a don't want to go upstairs, whatever the case is. So universal design is a proactive approach that we want to do, so that when we are designing something, we are looking at how the design happens and how we can make it accessible as we go along. So our folks have some expertise in that area. Again, I think Roxanna's been really trying to put some stuff out there, and some of the websites that Ethan put up relate to that and speak to that. And so the one thing I'd like you to go sort of come away with is we follow all of these laws when we actually have a student come in. And so a student doesn't just get to walk in and say, hey, I want you to do this. There's a whole process behind the scenes that happens that evaluates the entire situation to make sure that student is eligible for access and accommodations and what those are. And so that process is the beginning with the student. And I think Joanna's comment may speak to this. There's an analysis many times that do happen to make sure that the person is a person that with reasonable accommodations and accessibility, offering accessibility, that they are otherwise qualified. So there's a lot of analysis that happens amongst the students to make sure that we can accommodate and that it is an appropriate direction that we're going. So we're more of the proactive beginning, trying to make sure everything's set in stone and make sure we're going in the right direction. Right.
I have a question regarding images, if you use them on your website. Based upon what I was hearing earlier, I guess I'm looking for clarification. An example would be on my Blackboard site. After I give an assignment description, right underneath it, it says, this assignment is due Sunday, such and such a day at midnight. Now above it, I also have a deadline graphic attached to it. Does that deadline graphic need descriptive information?
Yeah, you need a tag behind it. So the tag behind it would say exactly what it says in front of it. And that's one of the things that we can get some expertise on campus to be able to show faculty how to tag those. Right now, the quickest and easiest thing you can do is not use the graphic and just use text. But if you have the text as a tag, you can do it. I think you do know how to do that, some of folks. So that's sort of my big spiel, because I'm just trying to be cognizant of time, so I'm going to pass it down to Joe, and then each of us are just going to try and give a little bit of what we do in our areas to really push this forward.
So in IT, it just seems to naturally happen all the time. So we do rely on some tools to help us remain compliant and stay ahead of the curve. One major project we completed last year was making the college's website responsive. And so what does that mean? It means that when you open your mobile device and you open a web browser, I'm not talking about the mobile app, I'm talking about the web browser, that you have the same experience size to screen as you do when you use your computer. So that was a major project that we took on last year. And talk about resources, it was quite costly. But there are some other things that we do in IT. We rely on, I think Tom's question was resources and help for faculty. There's a number of systems, content management systems that do a number of things, and one of the systems we rely on scans all our content, gives us a report at the end of the week, and that requires action. And so some of that action can be remediated in IT. And some of that action actually needs to be mediated with just about everybody in this room. So that is part of the overall plan. How do we maintain our level of compliance? In terms of video, we have a contract with, let's screw the name up, Evan, Celio 24, where you can register your video with the service desk. We send it out. Our partner digitizes, makes the video compliant, sends it back to us with a URL for you. And then I think we're all relying on the LMS and the Alley tool that's embedded there, but I think that there's more discussion and ideas needed about how to utilize that tool as well. And for the sake of time, I'll pass it to my friend Beth. You can talk about the website.
Hi everyone. So in the marketing realm, there are two major areas that my team works on when it comes to accessibility. One is our digital content. The other is, of course, all of the PDFs that we make for all of you. Seeing all of very familiar client faces in the office, we create a lot of PDFs for you. And so one of the things that we are doing along with IT is creating some documentation about how to create accessible PDFs. So my staff will be creating PDFs that are accessible, and we will also be able to work with you if you're creating PDFs on your own, whatever software that you're using. The other area that we've spent some significant attention to lately is our social media. And so Ronnie on my team, who is our social media coordinator, has been spending a lot of time creating some best practices and documentation around the best way to tag the college's content. Many of you also have social media accounts here at the institution for your particular division or program, and our team will be able to help work with you and advise you and give you the tools on how to make your social media accessible going forward. We don't expect, and none of us up here expect you to do all of this on your own. We're going to be providing you the tools necessary. And as you all have heard, we're going to be looking at a new website. That makes many of you very happy. And one thing that we, of course, will be looking at with whatever vendor we end up picking is accessibility. This process for a new website is not going to happen overnight. So we are looking for it to be down the road. We're going to be starting this semester, but we're not going to actually have a new website for you by September. The process just takes longer than that. But what we can do in the interim is my team can work with you to make sure that your web content now is accessible. So there's lots of things that you can do to your content, to the way that you place images, to how you name links, that my team has the expertise to help you create that content. So when we do have a new site, you are already ADA compliant and that copy can just be floated.
So as far as overall compliance is concerned, some of the overarching themes, yes, is website accessibility, but we really have a lot more than that. One thing I challenge everyone to think about is that we all have a role in compliance. And so what is that you're teaching in the classroom? Is that accessible? What programs are you running? Are those accessible? Are they in accessible locations? If you're taking students on service trips, are those places accessible? So those are the things that we need to start thinking about when you're talking about content in your classroom. We're all happy to consult. That's something that we really need to commit to start doing every day, right away, because that will prevent those litigations and lawsuits that Evan and David had talked about. And so I'm happy to consult. I think one thing that I see from compliance that we run into issues with is when an employee or a student or a member of the public asks us for an accommodation, and we directly challenge them on why they need it and what our thoughts are about those, and that's gotten us into some sticky situations. So I ask you, when those situations come up, we are the people that you should consult about those. So if you have a student that requests an accommodation and you don't think that that accommodation is appropriate, the person that you need to talk to is Disability Support Services, not the student. If you have an employee that needs an accommodation, it's not directly questioning why they need the accommodation. It's talking to HR or talking to myself about what's appropriate. We often see members of the public come on with service animals. We're very restricted in what we can ask about a service animal, and that can get us into trouble, both with the ADA, but also with public accommodation law. And so really pick up the phone and call before you challenge people, because that's when we find ourselves in a really sticky situation. So please, I don't need to be the compliance director or the bad guy. We're here as a resource. We want to help, and we want to prevent you from slipping in mud that you don't need to. And so please reach out and call or send emails to say, I need some guidance on this. We're very happy to do it. I do it constantly with faculty and staff around issues that they're struggling with. I'm happy to help because it will help us further our compliance with ADA and other non-discrimination laws.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but over here we can't see you and we can't hear you very well. I would love to contact you, except I don't know who you are.
Elisa Chapman, I'm the Director of Compliance.
Thank you.
Can I just add one thing to that? I think that's such an important point that oftentimes there are situations in which we know that it may be a fundamental alteration to give something, or there may be a hunch that this person doesn't have the limitations that require this type of accommodation. Bottom line, end of the day, that may be the case. You may be correct in making that assumption, but the legal requirement isn't always necessarily giving someone what they want, or even something that we may be able to do. The legal requirement is to enter into the interactive process, is to have a conversation with the appropriate people on campus to make that evaluation and make that determination. So you may be correct in your assumptions, but I think there is a very important reason why we want to get those cases to the folks that can help you out, rather than, as Elisa says, really jumping in and making that determination yourself.
And DCAM has a statewide team that follows a four-step accessibility compliance review process for any state project and any work performed in the Commonwealth-owned buildings. DCAM projects that are funded must be in compliance with state and federal accessibility laws and regulations. And I'm just going to throw some examples of some of the projects that we have ongoing. These are some of the smaller projects. Classroom refresh, access aisles, accessibility pathway projects, stairs, walkways, ramps, automatic doors, accessible parking, signage, paper towel, electric hand dryer, changing stations, water bubble filling stations, and proper placement of those in the required areas. And then the largest scope construction projects like the Academic Performing Arts Center, the Biotech Lab, the Dental Clinic, the Federal Parking Lot Paving Project, Bedford Accessibility Pathway Improvement Project. All these projects follow a four-step accessibility review process once the scope and size of the project has been determined. Now, the four steps in the process is first the study and a code review is completed. And then at each document review phase is completion, there's a design review. And there's a review during construction of the projects. And there's a post-construction review to make sure that whatever the document said, we need to put these places in place, and there's a project closeout. And all of these are work very closely with DCAM's statewide accessibility team, and they're a great resource for information for us. And believe me, questions come up all the time. Especially when you have a campus that has older buildings, to make sure that we put things in the right place.
That's a great point. I mean, I used to serve on the state's Architectural Access Board. I've worked with Paul and Chris and all the folks over there. We're very fortunate to have a state that when state funds that are appropriated go to a project, they're looking at the accessibility side of things. And for example, our state's Architectural Access Code has specific parameters around that issue of kiosks that I mentioned. So it may be things that, to your point, that we don't necessarily look at from maybe physical accessibility point, but that there are accessibility, digital accessibility components and physical reach, range, access components to all those projects. Yeah. So we'll see if there's any more questions out there. We have another one over here on the left.
Can you guys hear me? I can be loud. I'm Corinne Ritchie, I'm from Disability Support. I also teach with the theater department. And one of the things that came up actually as an adjunct faculty is closed captioning is not the same thing as audio describing. And if you send something off for closed captioning, it doesn't come back audio described. So if you have something with a lot of activity where there's not any sound, that's not accessible. And so what we have done is, like, I literally sat next to my blind student in my theater class and I audio described for her in real time. She was okay with that. We talked about that in advance. But my question to the people who have funds is, what do we do if we have something that can't be accessed another way? Like if I'm teaching a devising project in theater appreciation, it's all physical. Do we have funds to get something audio described?
Well, I think that's the process that we're trying to find out now, Corinne, is that we are trying to look at the funds and we're trying to look at the capacity. So that we have to find out what's out there and what is needed. And once we really can once we can grasp what we need, we can look at the funding. We've had different opportunities for funding, but we haven't been able to take advantage of them because we haven't been able to know what the need is. And this is really our first, hey folks, this is what we have to comply with. This is what's out there. This is what we really need to do. It's been there for a long time. We've been trying to do it. This is the first time we've been able to really get some momentum behind this. The president has brought this forward. That's why it's at this professional day. And we have to attack it as a team. So that we find out, wow, we didn't think of it. We didn't think about that audio descripting. And if you've ever listened to audio descripting, it's amazing. And so it does give someone who is blind the opportunity to hear everything that we see. And there's a perfect example of what just happened over here. There's a population of folks that didn't get to see us or hear us. And that's exactly what our students with disabilities feel like, when we forget that they're in the room and that they need this access. So I think we're on the right track. I just think we need to come together as a team and you need to start looking at your own stuff and what it is in your area that you know you use, if you're using PDFs, if you're using YouTube videos, if you're using any of those kinds of things. You have to start to sort of make a list of what it is and how we may be able to come in compliance, and then we'll be able to find out what is it. Do we hire someone to come in and do all of this tagging in the back? Do we hire someone to come in to do descriptive? I will hire you, Corinne, if we are going to do descriptive. So I think it's a combo of us coming together, and this is really our first step, and we're not saying we have all the answers. We're basically just saying, here it is. We brought Evan in because he was able to explain it better than anybody was able to explain it. Could you imagine us trying to tell you this? Oh my God. And so this has really got us on the first step in moving us forward.
I think just to piggyback on Pam's response, don't tell Frank Noceller I said this, but I don't care about funding. I think we rely on the experts which are in the room to tell us what you need. The CLO 24 video capturing, that was an all-state effort, so there's 15 communities, 10 state schools. We're all working together at the CIO level and at the CFO level, and a lot of the resources and technology we're buying collectively, so that's actually driving the cost down. So I don't want you to really worry about cost, let us worry about it, just tell us what you need.
So at the end of the day, the ADA is going to say to us, unless it bankrupts the college, we have to pay for it, right? And so that's our way of saying, we need to get a list of what these things are so that we can start to prioritize and figure out what do we need to outsource, what can we do in-house, and how can we figure that out? Because at the end of the day, we pretty much have to do everything. You know, unless we can say, this is going to bankrupt the college, the obligation is on us to do it.
And if anybody's feeling extremely overwhelmed, it's okay, because I'm feeling very overwhelmed with it. But if you go back 25 years when I first came here, that was around when the ADA was first sort of really being implemented. And what we did is we did an analysis of the entire college, and we looked at all of the access, and we looked at everything that was not accessible, made a list, organized it, prioritized it. We're still working on that list. So as long as we're going forward and we're taking the priorities of what is the most important and what are the things that are affecting the most students and how do we fix that so the most students can have that access. And as we get the onesies, twosies, we look at them and we don't just feel overwhelmed by it. We come in as a team and we look at how do we make it accessible. Glasma.
I'm Glasma Perez Silva. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, I am the Disability Support Coordinator at Lowell Campus, and I am in charge to make sure that we have accessibility online for students with disabilities, sensorial disability. One, I believe that this is the most basic step that we can follow. One of the most challenging issues that I find is if you make a photocopy of a document to put it online, if the document is on PDF, the digital reader won't recognize that document. So usually I have to convert those on Word in order to have them accessible. So if you put the document in Word format, automatically it will be accessible. Second, if you made a photocopy of a book, and the book and the copy got the last words or the last letters of a word, the digital reader won't recognize that. And I will bother you back requesting additional documentation or requesting to have something updated, because definitely it's not going to work for a person with visual impairment. So those two aspects, I think, that are very basic, and it will be putting us in the right track.
Thank you. Joanne.
So thank you, Glasma. I think that's really helpful to folks, and I think that over the years, we've been attacking this problem like one student, one instructor, one class at a time. So I think the effort to get sort of, departments and entire groups of people together to share, I think will make the system work a little bit better.
And I think to that point, I think that there's, and hopefully this came across in my presentation, there's affirmative obligations for us across the board, and I agree that college taking a step is important. I don't think we're ever fully going to have the toolkit of what we're doing here is always going to meet the needs of all of our students. There's always going to be that piece, and I know that's frustrating to certain folks that we can't always have the answers, but to hear certain things, like Pam and said, or other folks have said, that if we can hear these issues as they come up, it's going to be a constantly changing, manicuring issue on how we're creating accessible content. We can do a really good job with 80% of it and get it right, or we're always going to have issues that are coming up, and yet again, that's the whole process. That's how it's built. That there is some ambiguity and there are issues and limitations that we're going to come into contact with that may be based on one student's needs in one course, but different on that same student's needs in another course.
And I have to say, we have one of the best faculty when it comes to this. I've been here for 25 years. My colleagues across the state are always jealous of Middlesex and the way that we actually collaborate and get to the bottom of what it is that the students need. So don't feel like, I hope this isn't feeling like we're not doing something. This is just sort of that next step, because the faculty around here have been extremely accommodating completely around everything STEM. You should believe it's amazing, math and STEM, and our colleagues are pretty jealous of what we do at Middlesex. Sal.
Sally Fox, science faculty. My question is about not the disability service, we work with them, but so I teach chemistry and I use a lot of PowerPoint, okay? So what can we expect to be the timing of it back, ahead of time? So that I'll know, if I have somebody in this semester, when can I expect to know? Will it be 2 weeks, 3 weeks? In the interim, until we get it, do we as a college accommodate? What can we expect as faculty for something that might be specific? What might be the timeline for that? When do you know? How do you find out?
So are you talking if you have a student in your classroom that's going to need an accommodation?
Yeah, other than going to the disability, for testing that. Let's say, and I use PowerPoint,
yeah.
Okay? So when will I know? In this interim, while we're working on this,
yep.
I can't accommodate everything.
Right.
Okay. So when can we expect to know that we might have one of these students who will need our assistance?
And that's one of the most difficult pieces that I'm going to have to answer, because we don't necessarily know. Sometimes we get a student the day before classes start, and so disability support is scrambling to try and make it work. We'll do a lot of work around this, might not be the right time for you to start, we might not have all accommodations in place, but ultimately they still have the right to do what everyone other of our students get to do. They have the right to sign up at the last minute. And so what we do try to do in disability support is if we are aware, we try to get the permission from the student to make sure that we can talk with the faculty member and help get the accommodations in the classroom, especially if it is someone who may be blind or hearing impaired, where there may be a larger need. So it's not a black and white answer, and we do try whenever we can. There are times when students will not give us permission to do that, and so we have to we have to value that and do what we can. But you will usually get someone that will call you if they know and that there is something we can look ahead of time. We try to encourage them also to get your syllabus so that we can look at what might be coming up and what might get in the way.
And would we expect to hear from you? Who would we expect?
What are the disability support folks? Yep, absolutely. Oh my God.
So we'll take one more question here just because of timing. We don't want to compete with the break.
Thank you. It's really not a question, it's an offer that can lead to a future question. So there is another accessibility need that's sort of invisible, and it's represented by potential students, employees, and members of the community around us who don't speak English as a native language. So while we have this great opportunity to work on our website and our web pages and associated documents that we need to present to individuals in the greater community, can we help also by making the English language more comprehensible to non-native speakers? And I will help in any way you want me to. How's that?
Of course you will, Marilyn.
Thank you.
Well, thank you all here today. These were excellent questions. Thank you to the panel, and I appreciate your time. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Ellen.